This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here, and I'm delighted to be here, and especially just to spend the day here talking with a whole lot of folks here from Emory. And I'm delighted that there's this much energy amongst not just a handful of people, but a whole lot of people here at the university who want to see this institution do the right thing. And take steps in that direction. This is really complicated. We were just talking about it. It's a really complicated, and it's a very tough issue. So I'm going to, since we don't have a lot of time, and I end up, not covering a quarter of what I want to, I'm going to launch right into this. But I promise, I will stop at some point and ask questions, make comments. But also, we're a small group, so if at any point you want to ask something, just raise your hand, and we'll do this informally. I want to start by doing a little bit of background. I'm going to stay put here because I need to stay next to this mic for the cameras. But I want to, first of all, just remind everybody that even though we're talking here at Emory, and we're going to be talking about Emory perhaps as we get into a conversation about this, this is literally a global problem. Everybody's got a problem with sexual assault. So it isn't that, if you pay particular attention to this at Emory, if you devote more attention, more resources, more effort to this issue, it isn't that you have a bigger problem. It is that you have the moral courage to face the problem. Everybody's got this problem. Every service of the military, every institution of higher learning, every religious organization, the Boy Scouts, everybody. We should all know this by now. We've had scandals that cover just about any institution you can name. All right. So really, the question isn't, do you have a problem? The question is your institution confronting the problem with honesty, with integrity, and increasingly, we're hoping. One thing I should tell you, I'm very blunt, and I will be very honest with you. One of the things that those of us who are kind of activists in this area are doing is we're pressuring parents to start asking universities, so what are your policies about sexual assault? We know that it's everywhere. We know every college, university has a sexual assault problem, so what are you doing about it? That's what we want them to start doing, because this myth that somehow, it's something that we don't talk about, so therefore it doesn't happen, that's going to be very soon really a thing of the past. One of the things that's just emerged literally in the last couple of years is a new front. So again, I'll be blunt, those of us in this field, we've been working for years to try to find some way to pressure universities to take on this problem more earnestly. We finally got enough pressure on the Department of Education. We also had Joe Biden in the White House, and those two combinations led to the Dear Colleague letter. And there's more coming. There's Dear Colleague round 2 is going to come, all right? And more after that. There's also this all of a sudden. Individual students who get on a blog, and between the internet and social media, one student can change your life, change the life of an institution overnight. Ask UNC, all right? Ask any university, ask Amherst College. And they're talking to each other. They're networking, right? So when things started to go south there at UNC, the students were saying, well, wait a minute, I just read something that's going on at Amherst College, and guess what? They emailed those students. And the students wrote back, well, here's how you get in touch with OCR. Here's the kind of letter you got to write to get OCR involved. So this is not under our control anymore. So let's forget the past, the attitude of we're going to contain this and shift over to, we know it's a problem. For 25, 30 years, we've been documenting the extent of the problem. It's your own researchers. All right? It's researchers at universities across the United States that have documented the problem on college campuses, in the military, out in the community. And they've also come up, by the way, with our standard-setting methods for containing the problem, for preventing the problem, sexual assault education programs. All of that comes out of universities. And yet nowhere has it been applied with the kind of consistency, with the kind of commitment that is required. That's what's got to change. And it has begun to change, believe it or not, in the US military. Everybody perceives the military to have this extreme problem. They do have a very bad problem, but you know what? They're also doing a lot more in the area of sexual assault prevention, and a lot more in terms of training investigators and training their JAG Corps and so forth than is happening anywhere else, frankly, in the world. And there are ways in which they are way ahead of us in academia. So the message is, it's going to happen anyway. The change is coming. And so rather than being caught under the wheels, let's be in the driver's seat. Let's drive the change. Let's make the change. Amongst all the other things, it's just the morally correct thing to do. It's something to show our students who are here to train and teach anyway. So I want to talk here about, and I'll be fairly quick about this, but I'm going to focus on offenders, since this is a big chunk of the work that I've done. And I need to address first the most common misconception about offenders and therefore also about the kind of rape that occurs on college campuses. There is a prevailing myth that a rape on a college campus, first of all, it's usually referred to as what? It's got two words, it rhymes, both one syllable.
Date rape.
Thank you, date rape, yes. I hate that word, or that two words, because what that really has come to mean is rape light. This is not real rape, it's not that serious stuff, the guy in a ski mask with a knife and so forth. The victims of that kind of rape, well, they're really harmed. We know that. And that guy, he's a real criminal, right? And we sentence those guys, if we catch them, we sentence them to some serious time in the state penitentiary. Now, date rape, that stuff that happens on college campuses, that's a different story. People think, first of all, that the victims of so-called date rape are not as seriously harmed. I can tell you we've got about 25 years of research that completely contradicts that, but nevertheless, that's out there, that's the myth. And the part of that is that the so-called date rapist is not a serious criminal. He was probably drunk, right? And so was she. There was miscommunication, all right? Here's that whole thing around consent. It's like they didn't really quite understand consent, or they weren't taught really about consent. She wasn't maybe as clear. There was miscommunication. Kind of like an accident of circumstance, a bad confluence of alcohol, miscommunication, maybe a little bit of lack of respect, things like that we could all teach. We could teach this somehow, teach them out of this. And of course, he'd never do it again because it was this confluence of bad circumstances that led to this, because basically he's a nice guy. The nice guy's in quotes, because when we do jury research and you ask jurors who have sat on these kinds of cases and heard the evidence, you'll hear them say literally, we do these training for judges, and we bring in jurors who've actually sat on rape cases, non-stranger cases, and the judge get to ask them questions. And the judges will say, so you felt the prosecutor proved this element? Yes. This element? Yes. This element? Yes. This element? Yes. And yet you acquitted him. Can you explain what your reasoning was? Well, we felt he was basically a nice guy and we didn't want to ruin his life. That's how deep and pervasive that myth is. And it's a real problem. And if you're prosecuting these cases, these are tall hurdles that you have to overcome. These are challenging cases. So what I'm going to show you now are some data that just flatly contradicts this mythology about what's going on in college campuses. So I'll start with a study that we did in Boston at UMass Boston, which is demographically different than a traditional four-year college because it's really a commuter campus. Students are a little bit older. I think the average age in our sample is about 24. They're working mainly, half-time, full-time, some of them. Kind of a cross-section of working-class Boston, but still young people and in college. We looked at 1,882 men. In that sample, there were 120 rapists. Now, just for those of you who aren't familiar with the research and the methodology, if you're trying to find out who's committed rapes, just as you're trying to find out who's been perpetrated, who's had a rape perpetrated against them, or any kind of interpersonal violence, we discovered like 20, 30 years ago now, at least, that you don't ask directly, have you ever been raped, or have you ever committed a rape? What you do is you construct very behaviorally explicit questions that define very clearly the act, the behavior, but you don't use words like abuse or assault or rape or anything that would cue a person to the fact that this is a criminal act that you're defining. Now, when we do this assessment, we have a whole long list of questions that define consensual acts of sexual encounters and coercive, and then acts that clearly meet the legal definition of rape. And we use multiple questions to ask, because there are various kinds of rape, as you can imagine. We don't have to go into the details of that. So that's the core of this research. We then interview these guys, and I'll show you a videotape.
So what date was the study?
This study was published in 2002. 63% of those rapists were serial offenders. And the threshold for being labeled a serial offender was 3, minimum of 3 rapes committed. That's the same as the FBI uses. So if we look at that sample as a pie chart here, you can see that the vast majority of men, 1,762 out of 1,882, don't rape and haven't raped. And everything we know about this would indicate that there's almost no chance these guys are going to rape. Maybe a small, small number of them might commit a rape at some point. But the vast majority of them will not rape at this point. And it'll become clear in a moment. What's important about this is that I am going to end this as a very demoralizing talk if I don't end this with prevention work. And I am going to end it with prevention. And one of the things I'm going to say is that, you know, the vast majority of people on this campus, like in any community, are there ready to be engaged with, to be educated about this, to be mobilized, to be given the training they need to be active members of the community to prevent sexual assault in all the various ways that it can be prevented. And there's a lot we can do. And there's a lot of, you know, the vast majority of our community is ready to hear that, to get that kind of education and training. Now, that yellow slice, those are 44 men out of this entire sample who'd committed a single act of rape that hadn't been repeated. And what we know about them is that they are very different than that red slice. They don't have the same background of offending, and they don't have quite the same level of characteristics that I'll mention when we talk about the serial rapists. What we do know is that it is, again, circumstances, situational determinants were much more important in the fact that they committed this rape. The red slice, 76 men responsible for 439 rapes and a handful of attempted rapes. These are the serial rapists. Again, now we're down to a very small number, 76 out of 1,882. But this is what you find if you do any kind of research on interpersonal crime anywhere in the world. The vast majority of it is perpetrated by a very small percentage of the community, and they're individuals, by and large men, who are serially offending over a long period of time. In fact, what we know about these men, and this is true about college rapists as it is about sex offenders in the community, is that they tend to begin this pattern of behavior in adolescence before they come to Emory, before they enter the US Navy or the Air Force or any other institution. And what it is that every institution essentially, unfortunately, mistakenly, brings in a small percentage of sex offenders. It's inevitable. You can't screen them out. And the only thing you can do is respond once they are in your community. And unfortunately, most of the response happens after they've already begun to commit harm. And they start committing harm. I'll show you. We've got remarkable data documenting this. Now, we have to dig a little bit deeper, and this gets a little bit more depressing. The 76 serial rapists, in our research, we don't just assess rape. We assess other forms of violence that they may be committing. And we assess it the same way, using the same kind of question methodology and multiple questions, assessing not just rape, but sexual assault and various forms of child abuse and domestic violence. And here's what you find. 76 men, a total of 1,045 offenses. This is behavior that goes back, so these are in their early 20s. This is behavior that goes back, roughly a decade. And it's a vast underreporting, let me tell you. There's no way that, even though there was nothing, I mean, we interview these guys and they're very, very open, but there's no way they can remember every incident that has occurred going back 10 years. So this is essentially a rough approximation of what they're responsible for. So I need to remind you, these are the people that are being referred to as date rapists. The basically nice guys who would never do it again because it was just circumstance and too much alcohol. And that's clearly not what's happening in the majority of cases. And I'll show you, I can back that statement up with some data as well. These are serial offenders. And even though I know it is sometimes jarring to the ears of those of us in academia to talk about college students as sex offenders. I do that deliberately in this talk because it's important to get over that. They really are. Everything we know about them. Yes?
How do you differentiate between sexual assault, rape, and rape?
So sexual assault in our research is defined as non-penetrating acts of sexual contact through either force or threat of force, as defined very clearly in certain questions. Rape are penetrating acts of sexual contact. Attempted rapes are attempts to commit a penetrating act of sexual contact through force or threat of force, or when a victim is incapacitated, i.e. unconscious, or completely unable to give consent. All of that examined, spelled out very, very concretely, in very simple language. Similarly, the physical abuse of children and the sexual abuse of children, 6, 7, 8 questions asking about very, very concrete, very extreme, actually, levels of abuse and violence for all those categories. It's disturbing. I know it's disturbing to think about this being college students, but I need to, again, reiterate, there's absolutely nothing surprising about these data. This is exactly what you would need to expect based on criminological research that's been done around the world for 5 decades at least, probably going back even further than that. What is jarring is that it's a challenge to our schemas. You know, we don't want to think that a student that we admit to Harvard, because I went through exactly the same process at Harvard University, of course. They're looking at me like, you're not telling us that one of our Harvard men, you know, but let me tell you, 10 years ago, when I first went to the Pentagon and started working with the Air Force, you're not telling us that one of our airmen. Everybody has that same response because we don't think of our people as criminals. And most of our people are not. It's a very small number. But that very small number, they are sex offenders. So just to pour a little more salt here, the average number of victims for each of the serial offenders at the time we did the assessment, so that was, you know, a certain point in time, was 14. So that would be victims of rape, sexual assault, child abuse, domestic violence, different configuration for each serial rapist. And of course, that number, that average number of victims would be higher if I went back and reassessed them now 10 years later. Of course, there'd be many, many more victims. Because that's the other thing I need to add. There's the other thing about sex offenders that we know is that once this pattern is established, if somebody has begun sex offending in adolescence, and we're now into young adulthood and they're into this really fairly entrenched behavior, this tends not to be something that just stops. Now, obviously, if they get caught and prosecuted, then it might stop. But otherwise, this tends to go on. And we know this, again, from sex offender treatment programs. There's so many different stories. There have been studies that, researchers have gone into prisons, gotten permission from the federal government to essentially give confidentiality to sex offenders in exchange for an honest accounting of when did you start, who have your victims been, what did you do, never leaves this room, right? Never associated with your name. And you know, a couple of researchers, happened twice, they've gotten permission to do this. And then you get this documentation of oftentimes hundreds of victims. And then there are individual cases. I don't remember how many people here remember John Gagin, one of our priests up in Boston, who was convicted, one of the few who was convicted. And I worked on a number of those cases, and our estimate was somewhere between 250 and 300 victims that we were sure of. And I'm sure there were probably twice that many in reality. And just a quirky little fact that I do a lot of forensic work. I do a lot of work in homicide cases. And I have evaluated, me just personally, have evaluated 3 men, 2 of whom are now on death row, who have committed homicides who were sexually abused by John Gagin. Just John Gagin. I don't know who else is out there evaluating. I'm sure there are other John Gagin victims who are now in penitentiaries around the country. So you can get a sense of the volume of assaulting that they do. Okay. So to continue that study, 2002, this is a replication of our study in a different sample, different in some ways and quite similar in others. This is a Navy sample. Age range very, very similar. 18 to 22 probably. And they've been doing this research at the Great Lakes Recruiting Center for about 15 years, finding higher rates of perpetration being admitted to by these guys, but otherwise some very similar patterns. In 2009, they published a study that was really a direct replication of our work. You can see 13% of the men were admitted to committing acts of rape, so that's almost 3 times what we're finding in college samples. 71% of the rapists were serial offenders, a little bit higher again than our percentage. Average number of rapes was 6 for the serial rapists, and that's exactly what we found. We found actually 5.9. Now, one of the things that they did is it being the Navy and them having a little bit more control over their subjects than we have in universities, they assessed these guys when they were first inducted into the Navy. So they were essentially assessing sexual assault committed prior to entering the Navy. And then they assessed them again 1 year into their service. And here's what they found. Men who'd committed a rape prior to entering the Navy were 10 times more likely to commit a rape in their first year of service. Now, talk about jarring. You would not want to have been in the room when the admirals took a look at this. But you know what? Once you sit with it for a moment, this is only saying one little thing, which is that these were sex offenders. And the Navy, they admit a certain percentage of sex offenders, and guess what? They continue committing sex offenses when they're in the Navy. So it's an important addition, but it's not startling. If you look at the 2 samples side by side, so again, here are the percentages of serial rapists, of the rapists, but here's the percentages that I want you to look at for a moment. In our study, 91% of all the rapes that we tapped into in that sample, 91% were perpetrated by serial rapists. In the Navy, it was 95%. This really has really important implications. And I'll mention 2, one of which is going to be really upsetting. So here it is. We'll get the worst over first. Somebody reports a rape here on campus. You've been put on notice. She may say, I'll assume it's a she since the majority of victims are female. She says, you know what, I've changed my mind. I don't really want to pursue anything. I just want to get some help from the counseling center. You've still been put on notice. And let's go back, let's say she says, I do want to pursue some kind of judicial case. What do? Do you simply investigate this case when you've been put on notice? The research is very clear that the vast majority of these assaults are perpetrated by serial offenders. Can you simply look at the incident? Let me ask you the question in a slightly different way. Let's say a student comes and reports, not a rape, but says something like this. Last night in the dorm at 10 o'clock, this guy tried to sell me a vial of crack. He had this baggie, it was all full of crack vials, and he offered me one, sell me one for, I don't know what they sell crack for, whatever. So the student makes this report. Is the university's response, well, we're going to investigate to see whether at 10 o'clock last night in the dorm room there was an attempted sale of crack, and that's it? I don't think so. I think the university is going to kind of just, in your bones, you're going to know that actually even more important than finding out whether or not you can prove that there was an attempted sale of crack at 10 o'clock last night in the dorm room, you've got to find out whether this alleged drug dealer is a drug dealer. Because you may have a drug dealer in the dorm. And that's a real threat to the students in your community. So somehow you've got to investigate that student. And I'm not sure what the difference is. I don't see how there's a difference if we implicitly assume if somebody was trying to sell crack last night, that he probably didn't find the baggie on the floor and say, I think I'll try to sell this. There's a good chance, we just make the assumption, there's a very good chance that this guy's a drug dealer. There's a very good chance that if you get a report of sexual assault, that the alleged assailant is a serial offender. Yeah.
What do you do if, at the moment it seems that if students don't really want to report rape, and then if they do, it tends to be to a counsellor, who might end up hearing 10 reports actually of the same person, same man, so they actually
Yes.
know
That there is, yes.
But it's been told confidentially. What do?
You get gray hair. We don't have, we were just talking about this. These are unresolved questions at this point. I mean, I have people who get this, who say, we need to have, law enforcement needs to start keeping lists, all right? So you get a report, the person doesn't want to pursue it, but you need to keep a list anyway. And I think, whoa, boy. I'm not a lawyer, but I can see some constitutional issues there. There are all kinds of issues here that are not resolved.
And I am a lawyer, right?
Yes.
We talked before, when you have put your finger on an enormous problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's an unresolved problem. We were talking about it, whether it's Title IX or whatever, or we've struggled with that. We've struggled with that for years. And the only way we've been able to deal with it is really through finessing it.
Yes.
Right? Trying to basically figure it out without
Right.
violating, this is all,
Yeah.
violating an ethical obligation or something.
Right.
Because if you follow the rules,
Yeah, you can't. Yeah.
if you follow the rules, you're hamstrung.
Yeah, you're caught one way or the other.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the only good news, I'll say, just on this question. The one piece of good news is, and this is just, it's quite unofficial, but we are working to get, with the worst possible timing because of sequestration, but we are working to get, and we have a lot of support from Biden's office to pull together not a conference, I mean, it'll start with a conference, but a real working group consisting of teams of people from universities around the country, and folks from DOJ, from OCR, from Department of Education, to work these problems. And, I doubt somebody's going to somehow all of a sudden think, oh, here's the solution, to come up with the best, all right? But collectively. So it isn't that every university around the country is tormented by, what's the best way to finesse this? Let's come up with a rational, the best possible solution, but one that is collectively devised, so that we move forward together. And then we test it. If it's not the best, so we tweak it this way, we tweak it that way. But what's happening now is I see everybody hamstrung and therefore not making any advances the way they could.
Go ahead, Ozzy.
Okay.
I was just going to say, I do think sometimes that some staff have reason to believe in a serious way that they have confidentiality that actually kicks in. But most of our students don't report these matters initially to somebody who might have, in fact, that as an obligation. They, in fact, report it to faculty. They talk with advisors of fraternities and sororities that they're members of. So, I think there's a little bit of mythology here about who has obligation to report. And, so what I worry about are not the people who, in fact, have some therapeutic relationship with someone that they're trying to support, but many people who believe they have a therapeutic relationship, and in fact, they don't legally, and probably even ethically they don't. And especially when you sort of look at this kind of data, which would suggest that there may in fact be other people. I use the analogy of kind of people being in the water, and there are other people in the water. So if you leave the sharks in the water, someone else is going to be bitten and injured. And so I'm trying to push back against some of our culture. I think this is partly what got Penn State into trouble. People didn't feel an obligation to report because they claimed they were worried about how the reporting might affect victims, and when in fact they had no obligation to hold on to that information, at least not legally.
What do you do if a student comes to you and wants to tell you and absolutely refuses to press charges and doesn't want to be involved? I mean, can you, the issues of confidentiality that are sort of ethical, that aren't legal, but are.
Well,
You mean you persuading the student?
Yes, if the student just.
Do we know if it makes any difference if students know that 9 out of 10 are serial?
Well, I think this would really help.
I think that there's some reason to believe that the more this information was out there, that it might, persuade some students. I mean, when
In other words, back to your crack illustration, the student, if the student understands this isn't just about the victim, but
Right.
you could actually be protecting.
right.
Yeah.
And that is what motivates many, many women who do make that really courageous choice to report. Most often what I hear when I'm talking to them, and I do a lot of evaluations, it is precisely because of this. I just had a case in the Air Force where a woman came forward, in the Air Force they have restricted reporting, so you can make what is essentially a confidential report and get services. But, well, she came forward to do a restricted report. And the SARC, the Air Force SARC who took her report, had literally just the day before had a full report, an unrestricted report from somebody about the same guy. And so she's sitting there, what do I do? So she says, you come back tomorrow. She does all, and she calls Air Force attorney back in Washington and says, what can I say to her? And so they go over, and the attorney coaches her. Here's how far you can go. Here's what you shouldn't do. They meet again, and she does a mild, but she says, if you thought that this might help in the prosecution, I can't remember how they worded it, but, and you know what? She sat there and she said, well, let me think about it.
If you felt this might help someone else.
Yes. And she was still on the fence, and she called up her sister. And her sister said, you have got to report. And she did. And because we had 2 cases, we won those. We won that case. And I don't think we would have won either one separately, but we won them because we had 2 cases. So I do think that, now we have to be very careful about, you can't coerce victims, and we have to be very careful about, if you violate the confidentiality of victims who report, the danger there is that you're going to suppress reporting, and which just puts you back at 0, right? So this is really, this is a real conundrum, dilemma, whatever you want to call it. This is a really delicate problem.
And that's why I was going to say, I don't think it's the Title VII rules that created it. It's because it is a true conundrum.
Yes.
In that you can draw the rules any way you want, but it is there are important values on both sides.
Yeah. And that's why there's no, it's not like there's an answer out there that we're just too dumb to see. This is one of the most challenging things that I have ever confronted, as a professional. And I think really what's going to alter the sort of the terms of the conundrum is changing the overall climate. Yes. So I want to just say a couple things about alcohol because there's such a widespread perception that alcohol is not only, we know that alcohol is a component in fact, in college campuses on a majority of sexual assaults that occur, but there's oftentimes that same old causal inference that people get, even though it's a correlation. And because it seems so compelling that again, if you have especially the conception that these guys aren't really bad guys, so then they wouldn't do this kind of thing if they weren't intoxicated, if alcohol wasn't such a problem. So there's all kinds of stuff I could talk about, but I'm going to just talk about one study that elegantly, I love doing this when I'm in a university setting because I'm sure there are people here in the audience who will appreciate research. And this does it really elegantly. This was a study done looking at 38 sites around the world, almost 8,000 college students, and they assessed binge drinking, antisocial traits, and partner violence. And that would include both sexual and non-sexual violence. Now, if they had not measured antisocial traits, but simply done what most people have done, measured binge drinking and partner violence, they would have demonstrated, shown a powerful correlation between binge drinking and violence. And of course, even though it was a correlation, most people would have looked at that and said, aha, more evidence that alcohol is the real problem here. But they did measure antisocial traits, and then they ran regression equations, and they ran, sort of those basic equations where you can check for mediation. Antisocial traits fully mediated the link between binge drinking and violence. That means when you entered antisocial traits into the equation, the association between drinking and violence disappeared. It was the antisocial traits that was correlated. And that was just a very elegant way of demonstrating what you'd know in 5 minutes by interviewing these guys. They aren't getting drunk and doing something that does happen, all right? That's that, you saw 44 men committed 44 single rapes. Some of those were that scenario. The serial rapists are doing this over and over again, and when you talk to them, they are very explicit about how they use alcohol as a weapon, how they get students especially, and in fact, I'm going to show you a videotape here in a moment, and he'll describe it for you far more eloquently than I can. In fact, that's where I'm at now. So I haven't shown this yet today, and I'm sure a couple of you here at least have seen this, but I think probably many of you haven't. When we do our research, we interview these guys. We do screening interviews after we've collected the questionnaire data. And the screening interviews very quickly, when I first started doing these 25 years ago, realized that, you know, I didn't have to do any kind of structured interview. These guys just start talking. And so, and we tape record them. So we have audio tapes, and then we transcribe them. So we have transcripts of these interviews. When the National Judicial Education Program wanted to make a video of this, they hired an actor, and he memorized a 5-minute contiguous segment of this interview. So you'll hear the exact words of the rapist. I also let him listen to the audio tape so he could get a sense of what the rapist sound like. So you're going to hear a 5-minute segment. And this is where I need to warn you, this is a fairly disturbing 5-minute video. He's going to describe a rape. And he actually raped 2 other women. These other 2 women were completely unconscious from alcohol intoxication. And this. So I'd like to give you an opportunity, anybody who has a reaction, anything that was either salient or stood out to you, to give voice, say so. I've plenty. Obviously, I can. There's so much in this 5 minutes that I could spend half an hour microanalyzing it. But yeah.
Like I said, I grew up in South Africa, and that's exactly that's exactly what would happen.
Yeah.
We had rag. It was like a carnival thing, and you could see. I remember my first rag. The older guys standing there drinking, and you could see. I remember them picking up the girls.
Yeah.
So i.e., it's not just here.
Right.
And that was 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Exactly that.
Yes. I know. I keep look. I go around the country. I'm all over the world with the Air Force and stuff. And I hear scenario after scenario, and it's some a little variation here and a little variation there, but the components, the core components are identical. Yeah. Anybody else?
Do you
Yes.
have any interviews with victims of this kind of their memory or their experience of what happened?
I don't personally. There are people who have interviewed victims. There are, and we're going to have more. I should mention this when at the beginning when I was saying here are the things that are coming down the pike. Brace yourself. There are 2 filmmakers in the process of filming the Invisible War University version. So they are doing exactly that. They're interviewing victims, of course. That's what the core of the Invisible War was. And there are others that have been done, but I think we're going to see some very, very hard-hitting films coming out in the next year or so. And I do, when I do training for law enforcement or whatever, I actually ask law enforcement to do a kind of a version of what your question was. I asked them to imagine now if I was going to tell you that you're now going to see a videotape of the victim of this rape describing what happened. Can you imagine how different it would sound? And for one thing, you'd hear somebody describing absolute terror. One thing just to point out, did you notice when he said that he put his arm across the top of her chest? Did you notice where his arm was? And so when I was in the room when he did this, it was, this guy was a big guy. He was 200 and some pounds. And this radial bone here, all right, the weight of that radial bone on a windpipe is actually quite dangerous. And within 6 months of this interview, this was many years ago, there was a homicide at the University of Wisconsin-Madison where the rape victim was killed exactly this way. That bone crushed her windpipe and it choked off her breathing and she died. Yeah.
I'm going to ask about collusion, because the other thing that he really describes, and this is a fraternity, and they have rooms, and obviously there are other men that are fully participating in the behavior.
Yes.
We've been talking a little bit about a small number of serial rapists that we find in the population, but there are obviously a lot of other men who are facilitating
Yes.
behavior. Some who may be first-time rapists, and some who maybe just don't go forward with whatever the excitement is in trying to get freshman women strong. But I'm kind of curious about I want to know more about your presentation, and I've been familiar with your work for about a year now. But I'm again curious about what does it say about those people who facilitate the behavior, since it's clear from everything I know by higher education in our communities, and I was a public defender previously, so I worked with a number of people who were actual
Right.
But I'm kind of curious about, what does it mean when we facilitate it? And there's so many places that we do and ways that we do. So at least
Well,
that's my impression.
Yeah, I mean, the people have used the term, and I'm sure you've heard it, rape culture, and sometimes it's a term that gets kind of thrown around a lot and misused. But there's actually an awful lot of what to call it. There's validity in using the term, at least in terms of referring to. There are representations of sexuality that are simply representation of sexual assault that are almost normative. Right? You can go on the internet, for example, and find sites that depict women at like Steubenville, right? Those images, that's all over the internet. I mean, Steubenville, these shocked people because they were part of a prosecution of a sexual assault. There are websites devoted to, you're at a party and some woman's unconscious and people are doing stuff to her. Take photos, take videos, and upload them to this site. All right? That's criminal conduct. Serious criminal conduct. But it's normative. It's like nobody's outraged by this. The FBI isn't tracking down these sites and who are those individuals, and nobody's doing anything. Which is simply to say that there is literally a normative part of this culture that does not view what is clearly rape as criminal conduct or even as bad conduct. So that's the sort of larger culture, and of course we can talk for ages about all the different components of that. And then there are, of course, in any community, there are individuals who have, for their own personal reasons, they resonate with that much more so than other individuals. They want to be part of this fraternity or this sports team, whatever it is, whatever group or clique it is that really has absorbed and internalized those images and those ideas and those attitudes and those behaviors. It takes a lot, thank God, for somebody to take all of that and become a rapist. It takes less to absorb all that and participate, as you were just describing. Just like there were students in the Steubenville, scenario who they didn't touch her, but they didn't do anything to stop it, and they were laughing and they were, videoing it and so forth. And that is, of course, part of what we're up against in terms of the prevention and education that has to go on in any community is, we're not going to convince those hardcore offenders to stop offending. We need to, as best we can, identify who they are, and when we do identify who they are, they need to be expelled. You don't punish a rapist with a semester of suspension. If you've got him responsible for committing a rape, he's got to be out of the community, not only to protect the community, but to the message to the community. But, the rest of the culture, the rest of the community, we're sort of moving into this anyway, so I'm going to skip over Frank here for a second. And the rest of the community is really what we need to analyze, and every community needs to do this individually. So the concept is kind of uniform, but then the practice is very, very individual. And in every university, or every military base, you would have to do this. Where is this happening, right? And when I go to a campus, if I have the opportunity, for example, to sit alone in the room and just talk to RAs, all right? And I ask the RAs, so you all have been here, juniors and seniors have been here collectively, quite a few years. Could you tell me where on this campus a lot of this is happening? Well, that'll take about 30 seconds. All right, so that's the sum total of my investigation. That's how fast they can tell me. I've been in camp where they'll tell me names. So the information is readily available, but that would be part of the process. So where in this campus are there hotspots that need to be addressed? But then way beyond that, how do you look at this community? Who are the facilitators? And for some of those facilitators, maybe the only thing you can do in terms of prevention education is saying, you know what? Be careful. Because we take this very seriously, and you'll be expelled if we catch you and we can prove to, and the standard is not beyond a reasonable doubt, to a preponderance of the evidence that you've committed a rape, you're gone. So you need to think about this. Now, some of these facilitators, maybe you can start edging them a little bit further away, so, and sort of start asking them, you know, these are sex offenders. Why would you want to buddy up to a sex offender? Why would you want to protect a sex offender? Why would you want to be like a sex offender? You know, so maybe you can just nudge them away a little bit. As you go further out into the majority of the men and women who make up your community, really what you're talking about is just education to start with. You know, so that they really do understand what sexual assault is and how it happens and why it happens. And then I think what universities need to do is to start doing what the Air Force is doing and the other services, which is universal bystander programs, where students are explained that, you know what, part of being a student at Emory University is learning what it means to be a responsible member of a community. And if you see a student, for example, at a party, and they're intoxicated, really intoxicated, and they do this, and they reach into their pocket to get their car keys out, what are you going to do? And we already have done this, right? I mean, you can be reasonably assured that if I had a group of 500 Emory students in here and I asked them that question, about 499 hands would go up. And they'd absolutely say, I'd walk in and say, you know what? I'm not going to let you get into your car. Not only would they feel like they had a right to do that, they would feel like they were obligated to do that, morally obligated. And that's not true. That wouldn't have been true 25 years ago. That is a change in norms that we have accomplished. You know, Mothers Against Drunk Driving and all the other, you know, forces that have combined to really change the norm around this. And so all we're saying is that we have to do a similar thing, and that as a member of the Emory community, you know, it's not just intervening with somebody who might get into a car drunk. It's when you're at a party or if you're at a bar and you see somebody who's really intoxicated, you know, that's a vulnerability. That's something you need to look out for, just as if you were vulnerable, all right? And then if you see, for example, now there's this guy bringing her another drink. Well, what does that mean? And is that the threshold at which you intervene? If not, what do? You know, and now he's walking her upstairs. Is that the moment? And in bystander programs, of course, this is what you do with, you walk people through these scenarios. And especially, you know, a good program, you walk through scenarios that are happening on that campus at Emory, you know, that they will recognize. And then you give people the tools. So I want to end on an up note. So I'm going to tell you a story, true story that exemplifies this. General Bostla is he's a 3-star general in charge of the Space Command in Colorado Springs. A really good man. And when the Air Force started instituting bystander programming, he said, I want the trainers here first. So he was one of the first commands that the entire base got trained, and he was there with them. Well, about 2 weeks after the training, and this went on for a number of months to get everybody trained, the following thing happened in a bar in Colorado Springs. And there's a whole investigation of this, so we know sort of all the facts. 3 women from the base, 3 female airmen, went to the bar and were drinking at the bar. All 3 of them were quite intoxicated. 2 of the women decided they'd had enough and wanted to go home. They tried to convince the 3rd to go with them, but she didn't want to leave. They left. As soon as they were out the door, there were these 3 male airmen sitting at this table, clearly had been watching. As soon as this woman's alone at the bar, one of the guys gets up from that table and walks up to the bar. On the way, he gets 2 shots of tequila from the bartender, walks up to this woman who's leaning on the bar. She's so intoxicated, puts the 2 shots in front of her, says, you know, whatever he says on me, and starts chatting her up. She drinks one of the shots. She then has to go to the bathroom, and the witnesses describe her literally staggering to the bathroom. When she comes out of the bathroom, of course, that shot of tequila that she just had is now really entering her bloodstream. She cannot make it back to the bar. She stumbles there's a jukebox. The guy at the bar walks over, literally half carries her back to the bar where she now is leaning on the bar. He puts the 2nd shot in front of her. At this point, his 2 buddies get up from their table and they walk up to the bar. So now there's 3 guys basically surrounding her at the bar. Now, while all this was going on, there's another table, 3 other male airmen who've been watching this. One of them has been watching this with growing discomfort, and he says finally to his 2 friends, we got to do something. This is exactly what they just trained us on. We've got to stop this. And his buddies say, leave it alone. It's none of our business. What they actually said is something a little more vulgar, has to do with what men are called who get in the way of other men who you know what. But he keeps insisting, and he's getting more and more agitated as he sees what's unfolding. Finally, he gets up when the 3 guys literally carry her between them, sort of out the bar. And they're literally going out the door. He gets up, and he says to his buddies, you got to back me up. Now, here's one of the benefits of being in the Air Force. When you tell your buddies they got to back you up, this is serious business. This is not a minor thing. So he goes out, and they follow him. And what ensues now is a beautiful thing. By the time they get out on the street, the 3 first airmen have this woman sitting in the back of their pickup truck. But the door's still open. And what he does is a beautiful example of an intervention. Because this is a fairly volatile situation. You got 6 now airmen, who've all been trained in various forms of killing people. Everybody's been drinking. There's some very toxic ingredients here, volatile ingredients. But what he does, as he starts talking to the guys, this is perfect, all right? He starts talking to the guys, says, I think she's almost sick, I think she really needs to get home. And he just walks right past him as he's talking to him, reaches into the car, what, would you help me? And he motions to his 2 buddies, and they kind of get her, and he's still talking to them. Now the guys are now fuming, these other 3 airmen. But he does this so fluidly, so smoothly, that they're really mad, and they're starting to call him all kinds of names. But he's kind of just beautifully sort of diffused the situation, or kept the fuse from being lit, let's say. And they get her and they put her in a taxi. The postscript to this is General Basla, when he heard about this, gave that airman a commendation in front of the entire base. And he hired, using his own money, a film crew. And they came in and filmed a reenactment of the entire scene based on all the witness interviews done by OSI, because they investigated. And that film is now circulating around the Air Force. So he used that scene to say, this is what it means to be a member of the Air Force, to be a member of the community. And this is what it means to be a hero. And really, sort of use that to really further the message and to change the community and to change the norms. So it can be done. It can be done. So I'm gonna stop my sort of talking at you and let you, it's sort of, I think, past the point, but I want to, if anybody has any other questions or comments that you want to ask or make, I want to make sure you have the opportunity.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.